I woke to the hoarse chanting of the alarm clock that had kept me out of bed for 45 years. Even though I was retired, I never allowed myself to stay in bed past 6 in the morning. I considered it a sign of promiscuity. After turning off the alarm clock, I allowed myself a moment of weakness to lie staring at the ceiling, where a crack like the Mississippi River crept leisurely toward the chandelier. My house in Lisburg had seemed too big since Horace died 3 years ago. He hadn't been the perfect husband, too soft, too accommodating, but he'd been mine. Now I was surrounded only by memories, frozen in framed photographs on the walls, and silence broken by the ticking of the large wall clock in the living room. My name is Bernice Havisham, and I am 68 years old. 36 of those years, I've worked as a math teacher at a local school. They say teachers don't retire, they just stop getting paid. But I am sure that something from school stays with us forever. The habit of evaluating, correcting, pointing out mistakes. Only now my students are my only son, his wife, and their daughter. I pulled on my robe and went into the bathroom. A woman with a stubborn chin and tight lips looked back at me in the mirror. My gray hair was in a tight bundle, no sloppiness. Not even in this. I'd always believed that outward appearance spoke of inner content, and I was a woman of principle, rigor, and discipline. It's Sunday, I said to my reflection. Family dinner. These weekly gatherings had become a tradition since Horace's death. My son Wesley, apparently out of a sense of duty, had insisted that I attend every Sunday. Though I suspected it was not my son's idea, but that of this woman he had the indiscretion to marry. Roxy Pendleton, now Roxy Havisham. I could never understand what Wesley found in this strange woman with her fanciful ideas about child rearing and homemaking. She worked as some kind of curator at the local art museum, a waste of time, in my opinion. When they announced their engagement, I tried to warn my son. "She's not right for our family," I told him. "She's too different." But he was blinded by her fake softness and those red curls of hers. I had breakfast, as usual, alone in the small kitchen. Oatmeal, black tea without sugar, toast with homemade jam. The same breakfast as yesterday, the day before, and a year ago. I valued consistency and saw no point in changing what worked. Looking out the window at the neighbor's house, I thought about my granddaughter Mirabel. She turned 10 last month, a smart girl, much like her father and me, though Roxy is certainly trying to raise her in her own way. All those art classes and theater studios. I thought a girl should get a normal education. Math, science, history. You can't earn your bread with art. I said this to Wesley more than once, but he only nodded with that uncertain smile he'd had since he'd gotten married. After breakfast, I pulled my best dress out of my closet, a navy blue one with a white collar. Classics never go out of style. That's what I always told my students. And the shoes, black, low heel, polished to a high shine. I always paid attention to detail. "The devil is in the details," my father used to say, and I agreed. I started preparing for dinner hours in advance. Although Roxy was cooking the main course, and I had to admit she was a good cook, though I never told her that, I always brought dessert. Today, I decided to bake an apple pie, an old recipe of my mother's. Wesley loved this pie as a kid. He often asked for it for his birthday instead of the usual cake. As I kneaded the dough, I thought back to when my son was little. I was a strict mother, but fair. He grew up to be an independent and responsible man. An engineer in a large construction company is not some curator in a museum. I was proud of him. The only thing that disappointed me was his choice of wife. Roxy came into his life when he was 32. Too late, in my opinion, but better late than never. However, I sensed right away that there was something wrong with her. She was too free. She laughed too easily, dressed too brightly, talked too much about feelings and emotions. In our family, it was never customary to flaunt emotions. Havishams don't cry in public, my father-in-law used to say, and it was true. When the pie was done, I left it to cool on the windowsill. The aroma of apples and cinnamon filled the kitchen, evoking memories of when Horace and I were young and Wesley was our little treasure. I'd never told him I loved him. That wasn't my style, but I hoped he knew it. After all, everything I did was for his good. I sighed and looked at the clock. It was still 3 hours until dinner. I decided to do some reading a biography of Margaret Thatcher, a woman I'd always admired. Firm, principled, uncompromising. That's what real leaders should be like. But the reading wouldn't go on. My thoughts returned again and again to the dinner to come. Our last meeting didn't end well. I'd made a few remarks about Mirabel's upbringing. Nothing major, just pointing out that the girl was spending too much time on her drawings and too little time on math. Roxy, as usual, took it personally and puffed up like a turkey. Wesley tried to smooth things over, but I could see the tension in his eyes. He'd always been a peacemaker, just like his father. Sometimes I thought it was a family trait among the Havishams to avoid conflict at all costs. Unlike them, I was never afraid to tell the truth, even if it was unpleasant. My students knew it, my co-workers knew it, and my family knew it too. The truth may be bitter, but it is always helpful, I used to say. And I firmly believed it. By 4 o'clock, I was completely ready. My dress ironed, my shoes shined, my cake packed in a special container. I'd even applied some lipstick a dark pink, not flashy. After all, I'm not some out there. I stopped myself. I shouldn't think badly of my sister-in-law before the meeting. It would only put me in a negative mood. I called a cab, another tradition. Although I knew how to drive after Horace died, I sold our old Ford. Too many memories, and why would I want it? Everything in Lisberg was within walking distance, and there were cabs for special occasions. Wesley and Roxy's house was in a new neighborhood in Lisberg, where all the houses were built to the same design, faceless boxes with small yards. I never understood why they hadn't bought a house in the old part of town, where every building had its own character, its own history. But this was where Roxy wanted to live, and Wesley, as usual, had relented. The cab pulled up in front of their house at 4:30 sharp. I paid the driver, trying not to show how annoyed I was at having to tip for a 5-minute ride. Then, straightening my back and holding the pie container tightly, I headed for the front door. Before ringing the bell, I took a deep breath. Be polite, I said to myself. For Wesley's sake, for Mirabel's sake. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the evening would once again end in tense silence and strained smiles. That's the way it's always been. It would probably be the same tonight. I pressed the bell and heard the sound of the doorbell inside the house, a bland tune that Roxy thought was nice. A moment later, the door opened and my sister-in-law appeared on the doorstep, red hair gathered in a careless bun, a welcoming smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "Bernice," she said, as always, punctual as a clock. "Punctuality is a sign of respect," I replied as I entered the house. The hallway smelled of something spicy, apparently the main course. I looked around the living room critically, as usual. Mirabel's toys and Roxy's books were scattered everywhere. A place for everything and everything in its place. A principle that was foreign to my daughter-in-law. Grandmother. A joyful cry came from the back of the house, and in a second Mirabel flew into the hallway with her arms around my waist. "Hello, darling." I allowed myself a slight smile. "How was your week?" "Great." I drew a new picture for the school exhibition, and the teacher said it was really good. And, "Mom!" Wesley's voice interrupted my granddaughter's enthusiastic monologue. My son came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "It's good to see you." He leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. another tradition I tolerated just for him. I brought apple pie, I said, holding out the container. It's your favorite. Thanks, Wesley smiled. You know I'll never say no to your pie. Come on in. Dinner's almost ready. I walked into the living room, where everything was the same as it had been last Sunday, and the Sunday before that, and the month before that. The same pictures on the walls. Too many, in my opinion. The same couch with colorful cushions that didn't match each other. The same weird abstract paintings that Roxy called modern art. I never understood how you could hang something in the house that looked like it was drawn by a child. Mirabel immediately dragged me to see her new drawings, landscapes and portraits done with colored pencils. For a 10-year-old girl, she drew pretty well, I had to admit, but I still thought she should have spent more time in the exact sciences. Very nice, dear, I said, looking at a drawing of some fantastic creature. But aren't you forgetting your math homework? Nuts. Mirabel is doing great in every subject. Roxy's voice came from behind me. She got straight A's in math. Good, I nodded, though I was inwardly annoyed that my sister-in-law had interfered with my granddaughter. But it never hurts to get some extra practice. Roxy just smiled that smile of hers that said, I'm not going to argue with you, but I'm not going to agree with you either. That smile always pissed me off. Dinner in 15 minutes, she said, and went back into the kitchen. I sat in the living room, listening to Mirabel talk about school, about her friends, about her new art teacher. She was a lively, inquisitive girl. I saw Wesley's influence in that, not Roxy's. My son was always a curious child, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. Grandma, have you seen my new rock collection? Mirabel asked, interrupting my thoughts. No, dear, I haven't. Come on, I'll show you. She pulled me by the hand towards her room. Mirabel's room was bright. The walls were painted a soft blue color. There were stars on the ceiling that glowed in the dark. Books, toys, and knickknacks on the shelves. And there are drawings everywhere. On the walls, on the closet door, even on the ceiling. It was a child's world, full of fantasy and color. Mirabel took a box out of the desk drawer and opened it carefully. Inside were stones of different shapes and colors, ordinary river rocks, pieces of quartz, something that looked like granite. See, this one looks like a heart, she said, showing me a reddish stone. And this one looks like a dinosaur's head. I nodded, pretending to be interested. Deep down, I thought collecting rocks was a waste of time, but I didn't want to upset my granddaughter. Mirabel showed me a small blue stone. This is lapis lazuli. Mom said it brings wisdom. Wisdom comes with education and experience, not from stones, I said. Mirabel looked at me in surprise, but before she could answer, Roxy called us to the table. Dinner was served in the dining room. Roxy had made a roast with vegetables, one of the few dishes she was really good at. I sat in my usual seat, across from Wesley. Roxy and Mirabel sat on either side of him. As always, I felt a slight prick of irritation. They looked like the perfect little family, and I was extra, superfluous. So, Wesley said, putting on his roast, how was your week, Mom? The usual, I answered. Nothing much. And you? And so began another family dinner at my son's house, where I felt both welcome and a stranger. There was a whole evening of fake smiles, strained conversations, and held back emotions ahead. But I was ready for it. After all, this was my family, the only one I had left. At dinner, I watched my sister-in-law from under half-lidded eyelids. Roxy was pouring soup onto plates, smiling and chatting about some museum business. Her red hair, gathered in a careless bun, poked out in strands, framing her face. She always looked like she'd just stepped out of some bohemian artist's studio, casually elegant, with those weird bracelets and long earrings of hers that jingled with every movement of her head. So, our new director has decided to completely revamp the exhibit of local artists, she said, setting Mirabel down with the vegetables she was trying to discreetly push aside. One, we want to emphasize contemporary art to attract a younger audience. Interesting, Wesley said mechanically, though I could see that he was only politely encouraging the conversation. And we're thinking of organizing a children's exhibit, Roxy continued, glancing at Mirabel. Mirabel could show her work. Really? The girl's eyes lit up. My drawings would be in a real museum? Maybe, Roxy smiled. If the principal approves of the idea. I couldn't help but comment. I hope it doesn't distract Mirabel from her studies. At her age, it's important to focus on the basics. There was silence in the kitchen. Roxy froze with the ladle in her hand. Wesley tensed. Even Mirabel stopped chattering her feet under the table. The exhibition will be held in the summer, when there are no classes, Roxy answered after a pause, her smile the same, but her voice was steely. Besides, creative development is just as important as academic. Of course, I took a sip of water from my glass. I just didn't want Mirabel to grow up believing that drawing pictures could be a serious profession. Roxy's smile became strained. I knew I'd stepped on her toes. A curator at a provincial museum was, from her point of view, a serious profession. Wesley coughed, obviously trying to change the subject. Mom, how's your work at the garden club coming along? Have you planned the spring plantings yet? I let him steer the conversation into a safe direction, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Roxy press her lips together and take a deep breath before returning to her plate. The first time I'd met Roxy came to mind. Wesley had brought her to meet us about 6 years ago. She showed up in a bright green dress, with loose red hair and a wide smile. "Hello, Mrs. Havisham. I've heard so much about you," she exclaimed, holding out a bouquet of some wildflowers to me. I accepted the bouquet with a strained smile. Even then, something about her made me suspicious. This excessive expressiveness, these bright colors, this readiness to call me by my first name at once, as if we had known each other for a long time. "You can call me Bernice," I said then, though in truth I would have preferred her to call me Mrs. Havisham for a long time to come. Wesley was fascinated by her. I could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he laughed at her jokes, the way he held her hand under the table, thinking I wouldn't notice. My reserved, serious son had suddenly turned into a teenager, smiling foolishly in the presence of the object of his crush. After that dinner, I tried to talk to him. "She's a nice girl," I said then, choosing my words carefully. "But Wesley, you're so different. Think carefully before you get seriously involved." But he wouldn't listen. 3 months later, they announced their engagement, and another 6 months later, they were married. The wedding was small but colorful, all in Roxy's style. They wanted to get married in a park, outdoors, but I insisted on a church ceremony. At least it had to be traditional. I remember standing in the church, watching my son say his vows, and thinking, this is a mistake. She's going to make him miserable, but smiled and applauded along with everyone else when they exchanged rings. And a year later, Mirabel was born. And that changed everything, or at least it should have. I expected Roxy to settle down, to become a real mom, but she kept working at her museum, leaving the baby with a nanny. "That's normal these days, Mom," Wesley would say when I voiced my displeasure. But could it be normal for a mother to prioritize her career over her child? "Grandma, are you listening to me?" Mirabel's voice brought me back to reality. "Of course, dear," I smiled, though I had no idea what she'd been talking about for the past few minutes. I was talking about a school history project. We have to do a presentation on some important historical event, and I chose the women's suffrage movement. The suffragettes? I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice. My mom helped me choose." Mirabel said proudly. She said it was an important topic that was often not covered in school textbooks. I glanced at Roxy, who was pretending to be completely absorbed in her soup. That's it, I said slowly. Well, it's a really interesting topic. Although I think that for a child your age, something less politicized, like the history of great inventions or geographical discoveries. Women's struggle for equality isn't just political, Bernice, Roxy said calmly, looking up at me. It's a story of justice and human dignity. And I think Mirabel might well understand its significance. Of course, I sipped more water. I just thought it might be a little difficult for a 10-year-old girl. But of course, you and Wesley decide what's best for your daughter. Wesley stepped in again, clearly trying to lighten the mood. You know what? Let me get the roast. It should be ready by now. He stood up and headed for the oven. Roxy followed him, casting an unreadable glance at me. Mirabel, sensing the tension, started talking about her friend Ellie, who had a new puppy. I watched as Wesley and Roxy worked together to prepare the main course for serving. They moved in sync in the kitchen, as if they were doing a well-rehearsed dance. He was taking the dish out of the oven. She was making the sauce. They were exchanging short phrases and understanding glances. It made me think of Horace and me. We'd never been so harmonious. We had clear roles. I cooked. He made money. I took care of the house and raising Wesley. He fixed what broke and paid the bills. We respected each other, but there wasn't that almost telepathic connection I observed between my son and his wife. And admittedly, it caused me a mixture of envy and annoyance. When the roast was served, the conversation turned to neutral topics: the weather, city news, plans for the summer. But the tension didn't go away. It hung in the air, like the smell of burning from the slightly burnt edge of a roast that Roxy was trying to mask with a heavy sauce. It's delicious, I said, though the meat was a little tougher than it should have been. Thank you, Roxy nodded. It's a new recipe. I added rosemary and thyme. It's an interesting combination. I cut off another piece. Though I've always thought classic recipes are classic precisely because they're time-tested. No need to experiment with what's already good. Roxy froze for a moment, but then smiled. I like to try new things. Life is too short to always stick to the same recipes. I heard the double meaning in her words, but decided not to react. Instead, I turned to Mirabel. Honey, did you solve the math problems I left you last time? Mirabel lowered her eyes. Yeah, I didn't have time, Grandma. I had a lot of other assignments. I understand, I nodded, trying not to show disappointment. Well, maybe we can do them after dinner. Actually, Roxy interjected, we already have plans for tonight. We wanted to watch a movie as a family. You're invited too, of course, Bernice. What movie? I asked, even though I knew it would be something modern and progressive. Maleficent, Mirabel answered enthusiastically. It's about an evil fairy who isn't really evil. Sounds educational. I tried to hide my sarcasm, but judging by the look on Roxy's face, I wasn't very successful. It's a fairy tale, she said, but with a deep meaning about how not everything in the world is black and white, and the people we think of as evil are often just misunderstood or hurt. Sure, I cut off another piece of meat, although I've always believed that children need clear moral guidelines. Good is good, evil is evil. In the real world, things are complicated enough without blurring those boundaries. Wesley coughed. It's just a movie, Mom. It's entertainment. There's no need to look for deep philosophical undertones in it. I was just expressing my opinion, I shrugged. Is that forbidden? No one's forbidding you to express an opinion, Bernice. Roxy's voice was calm, but I could see her clutching her fork a little tighter than necessary. It's just that sometimes you don't seem to approve of anything we do with Mirabel. I'm just worried about my granddaughter. I looked her straight in the eye, like any grandmother would. "And we appreciate your concern," she replied. "But remember that Wesley and I are her parents, and we make decisions based on what we think is best for her." "Of course," I nodded. I'd never questioned that, but we both knew it wasn't true. I'd questioned their decisions from the very beginning, from the moment Wesley had announced his engagement to this woman. Too bright, too loud, too wrong. I remembered trying to talk him out of getting married. It was our last serious conversation before the ceremony. We were sitting on the veranda of my house, drinking tea, and I said, "Wesley, think again. You're completely different people. You're serious, grounded, and she's like a butterfly, beautiful but fickle. What happens in a year, 5 years from now, when the brightness fades and only everyday life remains?" He looked at me for a long moment, then quietly replied, "Mom, I love her precisely because she's not like me. She makes my life brighter, fuller, and I'm sure our differences are not a problem, but an advantage." I didn't pursue that conversation further, but I couldn't get rid of the thought that he was making a mistake. And when they got married, I began to wait for their relationship to start cracking at the seams, for the reality of everyday life to shatter that bright illusion of love. But as the years went by, they only seemed to grow closer, and it confused me. I didn't understand what he saw in her, why he tolerated her strange ideas about parenting, her career that took up so much time she could have spent with her family. "Bernice, would you like another roast?" Roxy's voice brought me back to reality. "No thanks," I shook my head. "I think I'll save room for dessert." "Yes, your apple pie." She smiled. Mirabel had been looking forward to it all day. "Haven't you, sweetheart?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Grandma's pie is the most delicious in the world." I couldn't contain my smile. At least I was better than Roxy at something. My apple pie was truly unbeatable. An old family recipe passed down from generation to generation. Roxy had tried to replicate it several times, but to no avail. Something was always wrong. Either the cinnamon was too obvious or the batter was too dry. "After dessert, we could play a board game," Wesley suggested. "We just bought a new one called Dixit. It has pictures and associations, and I think you'll like it, Mom." "Maybe," I nodded, though I doubted I'd like a modern game with pictures. I preferred the classics: chess, Scrabble, bridge. "Or we could just talk," Roxy said. "Bernice, you haven't told us about your garden club in a while. How are the preparations for the spring festival going?" I looked at her in surprise. She didn't usually show any interest in my classes. Perhaps it was another attempt at rapport, or perhaps she was just looking for a safe topic of conversation. "Pretty good," I replied. "We plan to emphasize local varieties. I'm in charge of the rose garden this year." "That's great," Roxy nodded. "You've always been so good with roses. Remember when we first moved into this house, you helped us plant the front flower bed? Those rose bushes still bloom beautifully every summer." I was surprised she remembered that. Indeed, for the first few months after they were married, I tried to make things work. I came by with seedlings, gave advice on gardening. But then there was a disagreement about Mirabel's upbringing, and it all went wrong. "Yes, roses are pretty hardy if you take good care of them," I said. "So are relationships," Roxy added with a slight smile. I caught her gaze, and for a moment I felt something like understanding between us. But then Mirabel knocked over her juice glass, and the moment was lost in the fuss of napkins and apologies. When the main course was finished, Wesley began to clear the plates, and Roxy went to the kitchen for dessert. I decided to help clean up, even though they didn't usually let me do that, insisting that I was a guest. "Let me help," I said, picking up the remaining utensils. "Don't, Mom?" Wesley shook his head. "We'll be fine. You rest." "I'm not old enough not to help clear the table," I objected, but he had already taken the plates into the kitchen. Mirabel looked at me curiously. Grandmother, why don't you ever come to us just for fun, but only on Sundays? The question took me by surprise. I didn't expect such directness from a 10-year-old girl. Well, your parents have their own lives, and I have mine, I answered after a pause. We all have a lot to do. But you're retired, Mirabel said. You must have a lot of free time. You could come more often. I like it when you come. I felt something tighten in my chest. That simple, childish question made me wonder why I really didn't come more often. Was my dislike for Roxy stronger than my love for my granddaughter? Maybe I'll come more often, I said, not quite sure if I really would. Roxy returned with my apple pie, beautifully arranged on plates. Wesley followed her with a teapot and cups. Dessert is served, she announced with a smile. Your famous pie, Bernice. We started the dessert, and for a while an almost friendly atmosphere prevailed. Mirabel praised my pie enthusiastically. Wesley was nostalgic about how I used to bake it for his birthdays. Even Roxy seemed to genuinely enjoy the treat. This pie is magical, she said. I've tried to replicate the recipe, but I'm never as good. It's the apples, I replied. You have to pick a certain kind and cut the peel in a special way. Maybe you could show me sometime? Roxy suggested, and I couldn't tell if it was genuine interest or just politeness. Maybe, I answered evasively. The tension began to build again as we moved on to discussing our plans for the summer. Roxy and Wesley wanted to take a trip to Europe with Mirabel. We're thinking of visiting Paris, Rome, and Barcelona, Roxy said enthusiastically. It will be an educational trip. Mirabel will be able to see all the art we've read about and experience different cultures. Those are pretty ambitious plans, I said, and expensive. Are you sure it's a wise investment? Wesley tensed. We've been saving for this trip for years, Mom, and I got a promotion last month so we can afford it. Besides, Roxy added, some things can't be measured in money. Experiences, impressions, memories, they're priceless. Of course, I nodded. I just thought that at Mirabel's age, she wouldn't appreciate the Louvre or the Prado. Maybe we should wait until she's a little older. We believe it's better to expose children to art and culture from an early age, Roxy said firmly. It shapes taste and worldview. What about summer camp? I asked. Didn't Mirabel want to go to that science camp we talked about? Mirabel shifted her gaze from me to her parents, clearly uncomfortable in the middle of this argument. She can go to camp next year, Wesley said. We've already talked about it as a family. I understand. I sipped my tea. It just seemed to me that Mirabel had shown an interest in science, and it would be good to develop it. Mirabel is interested in many things. Roxy put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. And we try to support all of her interests, whether it's art, science, or anything else. I wanted to object, but I decided not to say anything. There was no point in continuing this argument. They'd do it their way anyway, like they always had. And I'll just stand by and watch my granddaughter be raised differently than she should be. After dessert, dinner moved to the stage where everyone is full, but no one wants to get up from the table yet. Mirabel talked about her school project. Wesley made occasional comments, and Roxy looked at her daughter with a pride I found excessive. Any kid can draw a poster about dinosaurs. That's no reason for such admiration. Mirabi, show Grandma your new drawing, Roxy suggested, interrupting a lingering pause in the conversation. The one with the fairies in the forest. Mirabel brightened up and jumped up from the table, running off to her room. At her age, I would have been reprimanded for such behavior, but Roxy and Wesley seemed to find it endearing. She has real talent, Roxy said, looking me in the eye as if challenging me. Her art teacher says she has an exceptional sense of color and composition for her age. That's fine, I replied neutrally. Though, of course, teachers often praise all children so as not to hurt their parents' feelings. Wesley sighed faintly, and Roxy's smile became strained. I knew I'd stepped on her toes again. She had high hopes for her daughter's artistic talents. I think it's time to clear the table, Wesley said, getting up and gathering the plates. Mom, could you bring the roast out of the oven? I forgot to turn it off. Sure, I nodded, glad for the chance to change the subject and get away from this tense atmosphere for a moment. I headed into the kitchen, leaving Roxy and Wesley in the dining room. Their kitchen was spacious, with modern appliances and those weird abstract paintings on the walls that Roxy thought enlivened the space. In my opinion, they just created unnecessary visual noise. I opened the oven and carefully pulled out the mold with the rest of the roast. The heat hit my face, making me cover my eyes for a moment. As I set the mold on the countertop and closed the oven, my gaze fell to the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet. There, in the very corner, stood a strange jar, not the usual glass jar for canning, but a decorative ceramic one with a lid. I wouldn't have noticed it if it hadn't been for the inscription in Roxy's neat handwriting. For my nasty mother-in-law. I froze in place, unable to believe my eyes. A nasty mother-in-law? Was this about me? What could possibly be in that jar? Did Roxy really hate me so much that she was making special jars with such offensive inscriptions? And what's inside? Poison? Some kind of curse? Evil caricatures. I glanced back at the door. The voices of Wesley and Roxy were coming from the dining room, discussing something about work. Mirabel was still in her room by the sounds of it. No one could see me now. Curiosity took over. I pulled a small stool over to the cabinet, stood on it, and carefully pulled out the jar. It was heavier than I'd expected, obviously not empty. I set it on the countertop and listened again. Wesley and Roxy were still talking, oblivious to my lingering fuss in the kitchen. With a pounding heart, I opened the lid of the jar. What I saw inside made me shudder. There were things I thought were long lost or discarded. I carefully pulled out the contents and spread them out on the countertop. The first thing that caught my eye was a photograph. An old snapshot of Roxy, Wesley, and I at some family picnic about 4 years ago. Roxy's face had a black bold line drawn across it from forehead to chin. I remembered that picture. It stood framed in the living room of my house until one day it went missing. I blamed the housekeeper then and fired her, despite her vows that she hadn't touched the picture, but I knew the truth. It was I myself who had crossed out Roxy's face in a fit of irritation after another argument. And then, terrified of what I'd done, I'd hidden the picture. When Wesley asked about it, I said the housekeeper must have stolen it. The next item was some torn pages from my diary. I went cold recognizing my handwriting. On those pages, I'd spoken very unkindly of Roxy, calling her an upstart, mediocre, bad mother, and other epithets that I was ashamed to even remember now. I remembered accidentally leaving those pages in places where Roxy would find them, in the guest bedroom when she and Wesley came to visit me for the weekend, in a book I'd lent her. I thought Roxy had never seen those notes, or if she had, she didn't show it. But not only had she seen them, she'd kept them. Beneath the pages of the diary was a wedding photo of Wesley and Roxy, torn in half and then duct taped together. I remembered the picture well and what had happened to it. Last year, while helping to clean their house, having insisted on doing so over Roxy's protests, I'd found that picture in a dresser drawer. In a fit of inexplicable anger, I tore it up and then blamed it on Mirabel, telling Wesley that I'd seen the girl playing with the pictures. This led to a serious conversation between Wesley, Roxy, and Mirabel. The girl cried, assuring that she hadn't touched the picture. Roxy didn't seem to believe she was guilty, but Wesley was upset. He had a long talk with his daughter about the importance of respecting family heirlooms, and I stood by with a look of outraged innocence. I placed the photograph on the tabletop with trembling hands and pulled the last item out of the jar, a folded piece of paper. Unfolding it, I saw Roxy's neat handwriting and the heading, Chronology of Bernice Havisham's Manipulations. The list was long and detailed. Roxy had documented everything every time I'd tried to turn Wesley against her, every time I'd undermined her authority in front of Mirabel, every sarcastic phrase I'd accidentally dropped, every little mischief I'd done over the past 6 years, with dates, circumstances, and even quotes. March 23rd, 2 years ago, told Mirabel that I supposedly thought math was an unimportant subject, though I never said such a thing. June 5th, last year, accidentally, spilled red wine on my white dress before an important event at the museum. February 14th this year, brought Wesley old letters from his ex-girlfriend that I found while sorting through the attic, insinuating that he'd made the wrong choice. I read the list with growing horror. Every item was true, from petty shenanigans to serious manipulation. Roxy knew everything. All along, she'd known what I was doing and had been silently gathering evidence. At the end of the list was a notation. I'm not collecting this evidence out of revenge or a desire to hurt. I just want to protect my family from toxic influences. When the time comes, I will show this list to Wesley, not to turn him against his mother, but so that he understands what is going on and can make an informed choice. I hope it doesn't come to that, and that Bernice herself realizes that her behavior is destroying our family and hurting all of us, including herself. But I can no longer let her manipulate my husband and child with impunity. P.S. This jar is my form of therapy. My therapist advised me to document everything that happens so that I don't question my adequacy when Bernice tries to make me think I'm exaggerating or making things up. I stood thunderstruck, rereading those lines over and over again. Roxy was seeing a therapist because of me? Was she going to show this evidence to Wesley? What if she already had? What if at this very minute they were in the cafeteria discussing me and my antics? Panic came on suddenly, like a tidal wave. I felt short of breath. My hands shook so violently that I dropped the list to the floor. As I bent down to pick it up, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Grandma? Mirabel's voice sounded very close. Where are you? I want to show you my drawing. I frantically began to gather up the things on the countertop, stuffing them back into the jar. Photos, diary pages, a list, it all flew inside the ceramic container. I heard Mirabel's footsteps approaching the kitchen. Just a moment, dear, I shouted, trying to make my voice sound normal. I'm just, checking on the roast. I closed the jar and tried to put it back on the shelf, but my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. At the last moment, I managed to keep my balance and put the jar back just as the door to the kitchen opened. There you are. Mirabel flew into the kitchen with a piece of paper in her hands. Look what I drew. I turned to her, feeling the blood drain from my face. The girl was holding out a drawing of some fairy tale creatures in the forest. At any other time, I would have scrutinized it, but now I could barely focus my eyes. It's beautiful, honey, I mumbled, not looking at it. I'm sorry, I have to go to the bathroom. I squeezed past a surprised Mirabel and almost ran out of the kitchen. In the hallway, I ran into Roxy, who was coming to check on me. Bernice? She looked at me with concern. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Yeah. The words stuck in my throat. I couldn't look her in the eye, knowing that she knew. Knows everything I've done all these years. I need to go home. Home? Roxy frowned. But we were just going to... I don't feel well, I interrupted her. I have to go. I have to go now. I walked past her into the hallway, where my bag and coat stood. Wesley came out of the dining room when he heard us talking. Mom, what's going on? I need to go home, I repeated, pulling my coat on with shaky hands. I don't feel well. I'll drive you, Wesley said, looking at me worriedly. Wait a minute, I'll get the keys? No, I said too harshly. No, I'll call a cab. It's all right. But Mom, I said it's okay. I almost screamed, which I've never done before. I, always in control of my emotions, was on the verge of hysterics. Wesley and Roxy exchanged looks of concern. Mirabel peeked out of the kitchen, holding her drawing and looking at me wide-eyed. Is Grandma leaving? She asked quietly. Yes, dear, I answered, trying not to look at her. Grandma needs to go home. But you didn't even look at my drawing. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear the disappointed look on her face, the worried look on Wesley's face, the calm eyes of Roxy, who probably had already guessed that I'd found her jar. Some other time, I muttered, and grabbed my bag and sprinted out the door. The night air hit my face, cool and fresh. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. Behind me, the door opened and Wesley stepped out onto the porch. Mom, what's going on? He asked, walking over to me. You've never left like this before. What's wrong? Nothing. I shook my head, unable to look him in the eye. I just don't feel well. I need to go home. I can't let you go like this. He put his hand on my shoulder. Let me drive you. No. I recoiled from him. I'll call a cab. Please, Wesley, just let me go. He stared at me for a long moment, a look of incomprehension and anxiety. Okay, he said finally. But I'll call you in an hour to make sure you got there okay. Suit yourself. I was already pulling out my phone to call a cab. Wesley stood there for a moment, clearly not wanting to leave me alone, but then, with a sigh, went back inside. I ordered a cab and waited on the sidewalk, not wanting to go back inside even for a minute. My thoughts were racing frantically in my head. What am I going to do now? How will I be able to look them in the eye, knowing that they know what I really am, a petty, spiteful, manipulative old woman who tried to destroy her own son's family because of what? Because I didn't approve of his choices? Because she was jealous of this red-headed woman who made him happy in a way I never could? The cab arrived 10 minutes later, which seemed like an eternity. I sat in the back seat and gave my address. When the car started, I looked back at Wesley and Roxy's house. There was a warm light in the windows, and in the doorway stood the small figure of Mirabel, still holding her drawing and staring at me. I turned away, unable to bear the look. The words of Roxy's note echoed in my head. I hope it doesn't come to this, and that Bernice realizes that her behavior is destroying our family and hurting all of us, including herself. But I'd already ruined everything, and I wasn't sure I could ever undo it. The cab took me farther and farther away from my son's house, from his family, from the evidence of my years of manipulation and petty shenanigans. But I knew I couldn't run away from the truth. It had caught up with me, and now I had to face it if I had the courage. My mind whirled with memories of all the incidents Roxy had documented on her list. I saw them through different eyes now, not as the justified actions of a caring mother, but as the petty, spiteful antics of a jealous, insecure woman. I'd manipulated, lied, hurt all to prove what exactly? That I'm more important to Wesley than his wife? That I know better how to raise his daughter? The cab pulled up in front of my house. I paid the driver and got out, feeling like I'd aged 10 years in one evening. The house greeted me with silence and darkness. I turned on the light in the hallway and slowly took off my coat. My reflection in the mirror startled me. A pale face with reddened eyes, tightly compressed lips, a tense shoulder line. I didn't recognize this woman, didn't recognize myself. I walked into my house, closed the door, and leaned my back against it, as if trying not to let in something invisible and scary. The silence was deafening. I flicked the light switch, and the old-fashioned chandelier illuminated the hallway with a dim yellowish light. Everything was as usual: a coat rack with neatly hung coats and scarves, a nightstand with a porcelain vase that never held flowers, a mirror in a heavy wooden frame. My home, my fortress, my sanctuary. But now it seemed alien, cold, unfriendly. I kicked off my shoes and walked into the living room without taking off my coat. Without turning on the light, I sank into the armchair where I usually read or watched the evening news. My hands were still trembling, and my mind was reeling with scraps of phrases from Roxy's list. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding," I mumbled into the void. She'd gotten it all wrong. But even as I said those words, I knew I was lying to myself. Roxy hadn't made anything up. Everything on that list had really happened, and behind every item was me, Bernice Havisham, a respected retiree, former math teacher, mother and grandmother. Me, with my unshakable self-confidence, my ideas of how things should be, my principles and values that I had tried so desperately to impose on my family. "But I meant well," I whispered, trying to convince myself. "I just cared about Wesley, about Mirabel. Is that a crime?" Memories began to surface in my mind, like air bubbles in standing water, slowly but inexorably rising to the surface. Here I am, accidentally, leaving an article in a prominent place about the harm of overexposure to art on child development when Roxy decided to enroll Mirabel in art school. Here I am telling 8-year-old Mirabel that her mom is probably too busy at work to remember her school performance, even though I knew for a fact that Roxy had taken the day off work and was preparing a surprise for her daughter. Here I am hinting to Wesley that Roxy seems to be a little too friendly with the new museum director, a tall, statuesque man in his 40s. They were having such a nice conversation at the opening of the exhibit. I just noticed it was nothing like that. All these little meannesses, all these subtle manipulations that I thought were justified, now appeared before me in all their unseemly essence. I wasn't protecting my family. I was trying to control them. I wasn't looking out for Wesley and Mirabel's well-being. I was trying to impose my own ideas of what they should be. I sat in the dark, tears unaccustomed, unwanted tears flowing down my cheeks. When had this started? When did I go from caring mother to toxic manipulator? Was it after Horace died, when I was alone and felt like I was losing touch with my only child? Or was it before? Maybe I'd always been like this, controlling, overbearing, unable to let go and let others live their lives. I remembered the first time I met Roxy. She came in wearing a bright green dress, with a mop of red hair and a wide smile. She brought a bouquet of wildflowers, not expensive roses or lilies, but simple daisies and bells. "They reminded me of you," she said then. "Wesley said you like simple, natural things." I accepted the bouquet with a strained smile, thinking to myself that I would have preferred something more refined, more appropriate to the occasion. I was already looking for flaws, already ready to not accept her, not because of what she was, but because she could take my son away from me. My gaze fell on the framed picture on the mantel, Wesley in his graduation robe, me beside him, proud and happy. He'd always been a good son, attentive, caring, responsible. And me? What kind of mother was I? I remembered how I criticized his decision to study engineering instead of economics, how I was dissatisfied when he decided to start his career in a small company instead of a large corporation, how I disapproved of his first serious girlfriend, Olivia, because she was too easy for him. And then there was Roxy, bright, confident, with her own views on life. She wasn't trying to please me, wasn't looking for my approval. She just loved my son and wanted to build a happy family with him. And instead of being happy for them, I started my silent war. The phone in my bag rang, snapping me out of my bitter musings. I knew it was Wesley. He'd promised to call in an hour to make sure I'd gotten home. I didn't answer it. I couldn't talk to him now. Couldn't pretend everything was okay when my whole world was crumbling before my eyes. The calls stopped, but after a minute my phone beeped, alerting me to a message. Mom, are you okay? Please answer it. I'm worried. I typed a short reply. I'm fine. Just tired. I'll talk to you tomorrow. After sending the message, I turned my phone off. I needed to be alone with my thoughts, with my guilt, with my shame. I got up and walked to the kitchen. Mechanically, I put the kettle on, took out a cup, a brew, rituals I'd performed thousands of times. But now every movement was difficult, as if I were moving underwater. While the kettle boiled, I stood at the window, looking out at the dark garden. My gaze fell on the rose bushes, the pride of my flower garden. I have always loved roses for their beauty and hardiness. Roses forgive neglect, I told Wesley when I was teaching him how to tend the garden, but they don't forgive neglect. Suddenly, the thought struck me. What if Roxy had been like those roses all along, patient, strong, resilient, but to a point? What if the jar of my exploits was her way of surviving, of not breaking under the hail of my constant prodding and manipulation? What if she wasn't going to use this list against me, but was just trying to keep her sanity by documenting what was happening? The kettle boiled, bringing me out of my reverie. I made tea and went back into the living room. I turned on the table lamp, the total darkness suddenly seeming unbearable. The light fell on a bookshelf where there were albums of family photos. I went over and picked up one of them, in a dark blue cover with gold embossing. It contained pictures of Mirabel's early years. I flipped through the pages, looking at the pictures. Here was Mirabel in Wesley's arms, a tiny bundle in a blue blanket. Here's her first birthday. She's wearing a funny bonnet, a cake with a single candle in front of her. Roxy is beside her, looking at her daughter with such love and tenderness that my heart squeezes. And here's a picture of all of us together. Me holding Mirabel in my arms, Wesley and Roxy standing side by side, smiling. We looked like a happy family. But was I happy? Or had I already started my silent war against the woman I thought had stolen my son from me? I remembered how I'd refused to help Roxy with newborn Mirabel, even though I could see how exhausted she was. You need to learn to cope on your own, I'd said then. In my day, young mothers didn't pass childcare on to their mothers-in-law. And then I'd hinted behind her back to Wesley that his wife didn't seem to be coping with motherhood. I closed the album and put it back on the shelf. The tea had gone cold, untouched. I sat in the chair, and memories, one more painful than the other, continued to surface in my mind. Here was Mirabel, 5 years old, proudly showing me her drawing. That's you, Grandma, she says, pointing to the figure in the dark blue dress. And I reply, that's very nice, dear. But, your mom would love it if you spent more time reading and counting instead of drawing. Not everyone can become an artist. I saw the light go out in her eyes, but it didn't move me then. Here, I forget to give Roxy an invitation to the school concert Mirabel, and then consoled the upset girl. Do not worry, dear. Your mother just has too much important things to do at the museum. Grandma will always come to your concert. And this is after Roxy specifically asked me for the dates of all the school events so she wouldn't miss any. Here I am, slipping Wesley an article about how creative professions are linked to emotional instability, and then innocently asking him if he thinks Roxy's been too cranky lately. All these moments, all these little mean things added up to a picture that made me physically ill. I wasn't being a caring mother and grandmother. I was being toxic, manipulative, destructive to my own family. And yet, a part of me resisted that realization. I just wanted to protect them, the inner voice kept saying. Roxy was no match for Wesley. She was too frivolous, too consumed with her career. I just wanted him to be happy, to make sure Mirabel got the right upbringing. But wasn't Wesley happy? Didn't I see his eyes light up when he looked at his wife? Didn't Mirabel grow up to be a smart, inquisitive, creative girl? Weren't they a happy family before my interference? I stood up and walked over to the mirror in the hall. From the reflection, an older woman with a gaunt face and tear-stained eyes looked back at me. I didn't recognize myself. Where was that principled but fair teacher who demanded a lot from her students, but above all, honesty? Where was that mother who wanted only the best for her son, not by her standards, but by his own? What have I done? I whispered to my reflection. I went back into the living room and sank back into the chair. My thoughts were jumbled, images of the past mingling with recent events. A jar labeled, "For my nasty mother-in-law." A list of manipulations written in Roxy's neat handwriting. Mirabel's disappointed face when I ran off without looking at her drawing. The worried look on Wesley's face as he stood on the porch, not understanding what was happening to his mother. I didn't know how long I'd sat like that, lost in agonizing reflection. The clock in the lobby struck midnight, but sleep didn't come. I felt drained, wrung out, as if something inside me had broken down and could not be repaired. At some point, I got up and went to my office, a small room where I used to check student notebooks and now read books and write letters. On the table was my journal, a thick, leather-bound notebook where I wrote down my thoughts and observations. I opened it at the last entry, made only a week ago. Sunday. Went to Wesley's again. Roxy, as usual, tried to impress with her culinary experiments. The roast was oversalted, but of course no one noticed. Mirabel is becoming more and more like her mother. The same habit of interrupting, the same overenthusiasm for stupid things. I tried to talk to Wesley about a summer science camp for Mirabel, but Roxy, of course, had already filled her head with ideas about art studios, as if drawing could give a child a normal future. Wesley, as usual, didn't dare contradict his wife. Sometimes I think he married a copy of his father, just as spineless when it comes to family decisions. As I read those lines, I felt ashamed. Had I really thought that way? Did I really see my family in such a distorted light? After all, the roast that day had been delicious, perhaps a little spicier than I preferred, but not overly salty. Mirabel didn't interrupt. She was just a lively, energetic girl who wanted to share her thoughts and experiences. And Wesley wasn't spineless. He just respected his wife's opinion, considered her an equal partner in raising their daughter. I flipped back through the diary, reviewing the entries from the past few months. Almost every entry was a complaint about Roxy, a criticism of her parenting methods, a sarcastic remark about her work at the museum, and in almost every one, implicit or explicit resentment that Wesley was supporting his wife rather than taking my side. My God, I thought, have I been so blind? So immersed in my own resentments and prejudices that I couldn't see how happy my family was without my interference? I closed the journal and set it aside. I wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to destroy all this evidence of my pettiness and anger. But it would be too easy to get rid of the physical embodiment of my thoughts while continuing to nurture them in my soul. No, I had to face the truth. I had to admit that I hadn't been a caring mother and grandmother all this time, but a toxic, manipulative, selfish woman who put her own desires and perceptions above the happiness of her own family. I walked back into the living room and sank back into the chair. It was starting to lighten outside the window. The first rays of sunlight were shining through the curtains, painting the room a pale pink. A new day. But what would it bring me? How will I look into the eyes of Wesley, Roxy, Mirabel? What will I say to them? How will I explain my behavior, not just yesterday's escape, but all those years of petty shenanigans and manipulation? Wouldn't it be better to just disappear from their lives? Go somewhere else, start over, let them live without my toxic influence? But that would be running away again, not from them, but from responsibility for my actions. No, I had to find the courage to admit my guilt. I had to ask for forgiveness, not expecting to receive it, but at least try to take the first step to fixing what could still be fixed. I didn't know if I could change myself at 68. I didn't know if I could learn to see the situation through other people's eyes, to respect their choices, their values, their way of life. I didn't know if I could ever be genuinely happy for Wesley and Roxy without trying to interfere, to fix, to control. But I knew I had to try. For Wesley's sake, for Mirabel's sake, and maybe for my own sake, so that the last years of my life wouldn't be poisoned by the bitterness of unfulfilled expectations and petty vindictiveness. The phone in my bag rang again. I knew it was Wesley worrying if something was wrong with me. I had to answer it, had to tell him. What? That I found a jar of evidence of my manipulations? That I realized what a terrible mother and grandmother I'd been all these years? That I regretted everything I had done? I wasn't ready for this conversation. Not now, when my thoughts were in such chaos and my emotions were so raw and painful. I needed time. Time to realize the full extent of my guilt. Time to find words that didn't sound like empty excuses. I let the phone ring without answering it. Then it went silent, and a minute later, a message came through. Mom, please let me know you're okay. We are very worried. We are, not just Wesley, but Roxy too. Even after everything I'd done, she was worried about me. The thought was almost unbearable. I typed a short reply. I'm fine. I just need some time. Please don't come over. We'll talk later. After sending the message, I turned my phone off. I needed to be alone with the bitter realization of my guilt, the painful realization of how wrong I had been all these years. I looked out the window at my garden, where the rose bushes I loved so much were beginning to wake up after winter. Soon they would bloom, beautiful, proud, strong. Would my soul ever bloom in the same way, cleansed of the poison of jealousy, resentment, fear of losing control? I didn't know, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to at least ask myself that question. It had been a week since that ill-fated Sunday dinner. I'd spent 7 days barely leaving the house, answering Wesley's calls with short messages. It's okay, I just need to be alone. Don't worry, I'm just not feeling well. No, you don't need to come over. I knew that sooner or later I would have to meet him face to face, but I kept putting it off, unprepared for the conversation that would inevitably take place. My life, so measured and predictable a week ago, had turned into a strange kind of voluntary confinement. I stopped going to garden club meetings, canceled my weekly bridge games with my neighbors, and even went to the store only early in the morning, when the risk of meeting acquaintances was minimal. What could I say to them? I'm sorry, I've discovered I've been waging a quiet war against my sister-in-law for the past 6 years, and now I don't know how to move on? On Wednesday morning, as I was drinking my usual black tea without sugar, the doorbell rang. My heart sank. I feared it was Wesley, who had decided to pay a visit despite my pleas. I walked quietly to the door, trying not to make any noise, and looked through the peephole. The mailman was standing on the porch with some kind of envelope in his hands. Dash Mrs. Havisham? He asked when I opened the door. A registered letter, please sign for it. I mechanically signed his register and took the envelope. There was no return address, only my name, written in a neat handwriting I recognized immediately. Roxy closing the door, I stood in the hallway for a long time, holding the envelope in my trembling hands. What could she have written to me? An ultimatum? A demand to stay away from her family? Or maybe it was an official notice from a lawyer? Though, no, that would be too dramatic even for this situation. Finally, I pulled myself together and walked into the living room. I sat down in my favorite chair, carefully opened the envelope, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The letter was handwritten. In the age of email and text messaging, it seemed a strangely old-fashioned, almost intimate gesture. Dear Bernice, the letter began, and I marveled at the address. Not Mrs. Havisham, not the dry Bernice, but dear. It was as if Roxy wasn't writing to a toxic mother-in-law, but simply to a loved one with whom there had been a misunderstanding. I am writing this letter because I feel I owe you an explanation of the situation with the jar I assume you discovered in the kitchen last Sunday. I realize that the writing on it was offensive, and I am truly sorry that you saw it. It was never meant for your eyes. Let me explain. 3 years ago, when the tension between us was at its peak, I started seeing a therapist. I felt like I was going crazy. Things were disappearing. Strange notes were appearing. Mirabel was coming back from you with new ideas about me being a bad mother. Wesley was upset and torn between his love for you and his love for me. I didn't know what to do. My therapist advised me to document everything that was happening so I could distinguish reality from my possible exaggerations. That's how this jar came about, not as an act of revenge or a way to gather dirt, but as a therapeutic tool to help me keep my sanity in a situation that seemed absurd and unbearable. I never planned to use these materials against you. I didn't show them to Wesley and had no intention of doing so unless the situation became critical to Mirabel's psychological well-being. It was my way of dealing with the pain and bewilderment, my way of protecting myself and my family without destroying the relationship that is so important to Wesley and Mirabel. I don't hate you, Bernice. I understand that you love your son and granddaughter, and your actions, whatever they may seem to me, were motivated by that love. I know how hard it can be to see your child choose a path you think is wrong, or start a family with someone you don't approve of. I am not writing all of this to make you feel guilty or ashamed. I just want you to know that I hold no grudge against you, and I don't want to destroy your bond with Wesley and Mirabel. They love you, and it hurts them to see you suffer. Wesley is worried about you. He doesn't know what happened that Sunday, and I didn't tell him about the jar. I only said that you may have found something in the kitchen that upset you, and that I would write you a letter explaining. Mirabel asks about you every day. She finished that drawing of the fairies and wants very much to show it to you. She doesn't understand why her grandmother suddenly stopped coming to Sunday dinners. I'm not asking you to go back to our meetings if you're not ready. I'm not asking you to forget everything that happened or to pretend that everything is okay. I just want you to know that the doors of our home are always open to you when you are ready. Sincerely, Roxy. I reread the letter twice, not believing my eyes. No accusations, no anger, no demands or ultimatums. Just understanding, sympathy, and forgiveness? No, not forgiveness. Roxy didn't think she had anything to forgive me for. She didn't see my actions as malicious, but as an inept expression of love and concern, albeit distorted by my fears and prejudices. I put the letter aside and covered my face with my hands. Tears, unwanted tears, flushed down my cheeks. I, who'd always prided myself on my ability to control my emotions, now sobbed like a child, unable to hold back. Roxy wasn't going to get revenge on me. She wasn't going to ruin my relationship with my son and granddaughter. All this time, she'd just been trying to protect her family without cutting the ties that were important to her husband and daughter. And she did it with a tact and dignity that I could only envy. And me? What did I do? Petty harm, manipulation, trying to drive a wedge between her and Wesley, between her and Mirabel, and all in the name of what? Love? No, not love. Control, fear of losing influence, inability to let go and let her son live his life. I stood up and walked to the window. Behind it was my garden, neat and tidy, with neatly marked beds and perfectly trimmed bushes. Everything in its place, everything under control. How I loved this order, this predictability, and how I suffered when something disturbed my plans, my expectations, my ideas of how things should be. Isn't that how I felt about people? Wesley, Roxy, even little Mirabel? I wanted them to be as I saw them in my imagination, obedient, predictable, conforming to my expectations. And when they turned out to be living people with their own dreams, desires, mistakes, I felt betrayed, deceived, out of control. My gaze fell on the rose bushes I loved so much. They were just beginning to bud a week or two more, and they would be in full bloom. I remembered how Horace had given me my first rose bush long ago when we were first married. Roses need care, he'd said then, but they don't tolerate too much control. Give them space, and they'll thank you with their beauty. I didn't understand his words then, or didn't want to. I tended my roses the same way I'd built my life, everything under control, everything according to plan, and they bloomed, yes. But could they have bloomed more lushly, more brightly, if I'd given them more freedom? I went back to the chair and picked up Roxy's letter again. I reread the last lines. The doors of our home are always open to you when you are ready. Was I ready? Ready to face them, to look them in the eye, to admit my guilt? Ready to start fresh, without manipulation, without control, without a secret war against the woman who was making my son happy? I didn't know. I honestly didn't know. Part of me just wanted to hide, to disappear, to avoid the awkward, painful conversation that was inevitably going to happen. The other part of me longed to see Wesley, to hug Mirabel, to tell Roxy, what? That I was sorry? That I'm ashamed? That I don't know if I'll ever be able to change myself, but I want to try? The phone I'd kept off for most of the week suddenly seemed like a lifeline. I turned it on and it immediately came to life, signaling missed calls and messages. Most of them were from Wesley, short, worried texts. Mom, how are you? Please call me, Mom. I'm worried. Can I come over? Mom, please let me know you're okay. The last message came this morning. Mom, I'm coming over tonight whether you want me to or not. I need to make sure you're okay. I looked at the clock. It was about 3 in the afternoon. Wesley usually finished work at 5, which meant I had a few more hours to get ready for the meeting. Or to run away. That thought flashed through my mind, but I dismissed it immediately. No, no more running away. It was time to face the consequences of my actions. I typed a short message. I'm home. I'll be waiting for you tonight. When I sent it, I felt strangely relieved, as if the reprieve I'd been giving myself all week was finally over. Then I wondered if I should answer Roxy's letter. What could I say to her? Thank you for understanding I don't deserve. I'm sorry for everything I've done all these years. I'll try to be a better person, though I don't know if I can. It all seemed so inadequate. So inadequate. How could a few lines apologize for 6 years of petty nastiness and manipulation? How could words undo what I'd done not with words, but with actions? I decided I'd talk to Wesley first. Maybe he could help me find the right words, the right approach. Maybe he could tell me how I could redeem myself to his family, if such redemption was even possible. I spent the rest of the day preparing for my son's arrival. I showered, styled my hair, put on a fresh dress, not the navy blue one with the white collar that was my uniform for Sunday dinners, but a light gray one, softer and more casual. Then I made tea and took out the cookies I kept for special occasions. All these were small, insignificant actions, but they helped me to maintain some semblance of normality, not to sink into the abyss of shame and regret that threatened to swallow me whole. At 6:30, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and went to open it. Wesley was there, anxious, a little disheveled, as if he'd come straight from work. "Mom," he said, looking at me with relief. "Thank God you're all right. I was so worried." "Hello, Wesley." I tried to smile, but it was weak and unsure. "Come in, please." He entered the house, and I noticed his gaze sliding over my face, assessing my condition. What did he see? The drooping cheeks? Circles under my eyes from sleepless nights? The traces of tears I'd tried so hard to hide? "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked as we walked into the living room. "You've never left us like this, and then this week of no communication." We were all worried. "I know." I lowered myself into the chair, gesturing for him to sit across from me. "I'm sorry I made you worry. It was wrong of me." Wesley sat down, keeping his gaze on me. "Roxy thinks you found something in the kitchen, something that upset you. Is that right?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "She wrote me a letter," I said finally. Dash dash. Explained about the dash about that jar. About why she'd started it. Wesley frowned. "The jar? What jar?" So Roxy didn't tell him, didn't show him the list of my manipulations, didn't reveal all my little and big sneaky deeds. She really kept it all a secret, not wanting to ruin my relationship with my son. The jar in which she collected evidence. I lowered my eyes, unable to look at him. Evidence of how I'd tried to interfere in your life, manipulate, harm you. Wesley was silent for so long that I finally dared to look up. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and understanding. "Mom," he finally said, "what are you talking about?" "You know," I shook my head. "You should have noticed. All these years, I've been trying to turn you against Roxy, tried to make Mirabel believe that her mother didn't care enough about her. Yeah, I did terrible things, Wesley. Things that I'm so ashamed of right now. I can barely look you in the eye." Wesley ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I knew from his childhood. He always did that when he was puzzled or upset. "I knew you didn't get along well with Roxy," he said slowly. "I knew you had different views on a lot of things, but I didn't think that you were deliberately trying to hurt our family." "I didn't think of it as harm," I admitted quietly. "I convinced myself that I was protecting you, protecting Mirabel, that I knew better, that I knew what was right for you, that Roxy wasn't right for you, couldn't be a good mother. But it was a lie, Wesley. Lies I told myself to justify my terrible behavior." Wesley was silent, digesting my words. Then he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my garden, the same garden where he'd played as a child, where I'd taught him the difference between the flowers and the trees. "I always knew you didn't approve of my choice," he said at last, without turning around. "But I hoped that in time you would see how happy Roxy makes me, how she loves Mirabel, and accept her. I didn't realize you were actively working against it. I'm so sorry. I could barely hold back tears. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the fear of losing you. Maybe resentment that you chose a woman who was so different from me, so inconsistent with my idea of what your wife should be. I don't know, Wesley. I just know I was wrong, so wrong." Wesley turned to me, and I saw the pain in his eyes, the pain that I, his mother, the person who should have been protecting him, not destroying his family, had caused him. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't. I got a letter from Roxy this morning. She She was so understanding, so generous. She said the doors of your house are always open to me when I'm ready. But I don't know if I'll ever be ready, Wesley. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look her in the eye, knowing that she knows everything I've done. I don't know if I'll ever be able to earn her forgiveness, or yours. I don't know, Mom. He ran his hand through his hair again. I don't know what to say. This, it's too much for me right now. I need to think about it. Of course, I nodded, feeling my heart clench with pain. I understand. You have every right to be angry with me, to hate me. I don't hate you, Mom. He shook his head. You're my mother. I love you. But I'm disappointed, and I'm hurt. I know, I whispered. I'm hurt too, Wesley. Hurt at the thought of what I've done, at the thought that I might have ruined your family with my stupid, petty actions. Wesley sighed and walked back to the couch, sat down, looking at his hands, the big, strong hands of an engineer, hands that were once the small palms of a boy holding my hand. Mirabel asks about you every day, he said after a long pause. She doesn't understand why you stopped coming to us all of a sudden. Roxy told her you were a little sick and needed time to recover. Roxy's too kind. I shook my head. She could have told her the truth. She could have told her that her grandmother was a horrible person who tried to turn her against her own mother. Roxy would never do that, Wesley said firmly. She respects the relationship between you and Mirabel too much to destroy it, even if you were trying to destroy her relationship with her daughter. His words hit me like a slap. Not because they were cruel, they were simply true. Roxy, who I thought was not good enough for my son, not good enough for his daughter, was showing a maturity, a generosity, a wisdom that I, with my 668 years of life experience, was infinitely far from. I don't know what to do, Wesley, I admitted. I don't know how to undo what I've done. I don't know if it's even possible. I don't know either, Mom. He stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. I need to think about it. Roxy and I need to talk. I'll call you tomorrow, okay? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Wesley walked over to me, leaned over and kissed my cheek lightly, a formal gesture that used to be filled with warmth, but now seemed like an empty ritual. Take care of yourself, Mom, he said and headed for the exit. I sat still, listening to the front door close, his car start, the rustle of tires on the gravel of the driveway. Then there was silence, the deep, all-encompassing silence of an empty house, where even the clock seemed to tick more quietly than usual. I looked at the envelope with Roxy's letter lying on the coffee table. The doors of our home are always open to you whenever you are ready. Would Wesley be ready to have me in his house after our conversation? Will Roxy still be so magnanimous when she finds out that I confessed my manipulations to Wesley? Would Mirabel still be happy to see her grandmother if she found out that I had talked about her mother? I didn't know the answers to those questions. I only knew that for the first time in years I saw myself as I really was. Not as a wise, caring mother and grandmother, but as a frightened, jealous, controlling woman who couldn't let go of her son and let him be happy in his own way. And that realization was more painful than anything I'd ever experienced. The summer rain drummed on the roof, creating a cozy background noise in my new apartment. 3 months had passed since that Sunday dinner that changed everything. 3 months since I found the jar labeled "For my nasty mother-in-law" and saw my life, my behavior, myself in its true light. I sat at the window, looking out at the unfamiliar landscape, the small town park across the street, the old oak tree spreading its branches over the benches, the playground where, now that it was raining, there wasn't a soul in sight. Windhaven, a small town 200 kilometers from Lisburg, was my new home, a place where no one knew me, where I could start from scratch, unencumbered by the past, unconstrained by the expectations of others. The decision to move didn't come right away. After talking to Wesley, I spent a few more weeks in Lisberg, trying to find a way to fix what I'd ruined. We met twice more. Awkward, tense meetings in coffee shops where we talked about the weather, his job, anything but what really mattered. I saw the hurt and disappointment in his eyes, saw him trying to be polite, but unable to overcome the wall I'd built between us with my own manipulations and scheming. I never got to see Roxy. She wasn't avoiding me. It was just the way things were. Or maybe she was giving Wesley and I space to work out our relationship without complicating things with her presence. It was so much like her tactful, understanding, wise, all the things I wasn't. Mirabel sent me a drawing, the one with the fairies in the forest that she wanted to show me that evening. It was accompanied by a note written in childish handwriting. Dear Grandma, I hope you get well soon. I miss you. Love, Mirabel. That note broke my heart completely. I didn't deserve such a granddaughter. Pure, loving, innocent. That's when I decided to leave. Not out of cowardice, not out of a desire to avoid responsibility, but out of a realization that my presence was hurting those I loved most in the world. I found a small apartment in Windhaven, sold my house in Lisberg. Too many memories, too many ghosts of the past. Packed up the essentials and moved without a farewell party, without notifying anyone but my closest neighbors. I sent Wesley a letter, not an email, but a real letter, handwritten on good paper. There were no excuses, no pleas for forgiveness. Just an admission of guilt and a promise to work on myself so that one day, perhaps, I could become a person worthy of his trust and love. Dear Wesley, I wrote, by the time you receive this letter, I will be far away from Lisberg. I have decided to move to give you and your family the space and peace you deserve. I am not apologizing because I know I have no right to. My actions were inexcusable. Instead of rejoicing in your happiness, I tried to destroy it because it didn't fit my idea of what it should be. I'm starting therapy. Yes, your old-fashioned mother has finally admitted she needs professional help. I want to understand why I acted the way I did. I want to learn to see things through more than just the lens of my fears and prejudices. I don't know if I can do that. It's hard to change at my age, but I'll try. Please pass on my thanks to Roxy for her understanding and generosity. She's an amazing woman, and I'm just now beginning to realize how lucky you are to have her. Tell Mirabel that Grandma is away on a long trip, but will always love her and think of her. I'm leaving you the address of my new apartment and phone number. Not for you to call or write, but just so you know where I am if you need me. But don't feel obligated to keep in touch. I'll understand if you decide it's best for everyone. Love, your mother. As I sent that letter, I felt strangely relieved, as if the heavy weight I'd been carrying all these years had eased a little, not gone. I knew the guilt and shame would be with me for a long time, perhaps forever, but it was easier to breathe, easier to look in the mirror without taking my eyes off my own reflection. My new life in Windhaven was quiet and measured. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in an old but well-maintained building overlooking the park. I joined the local book club, not for socialization, but to keep my mind occupied with something other than endlessly replaying past mistakes. I started going for long walks. I used to think they were a waste of time, but now I've learned to appreciate the quiet and the opportunity to be alone with my thoughts. And, as I promised in the letter, I started therapy. Dr. Eleanor Pierce, a woman about my age, with kind eyes and a firm voice, became my guide on my journey to myself, the real me, without masks or self-deception. Tell me about your mother, Bernice, she asked in one of the first sessions. My mother? I was surprised. What did she have to do with it? I came to talk about my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. Often our relationships with our children reflect the patterns we learned in our own childhood. Dr. Pierce explained calmly. Tell me about her. What was she like? I wondered. The image of my mother came to mind. Tall, straight, always impeccably dressed, with a tight bundle of gray hair. She was strict, I said at last, demanding, always knew what was right and what was wrong, didn't tolerate objection. Did she show you love? Not with words. I shook my head. She thought showing affection was a sign of weakness, but I knew she loved me. She just showed it in her own way, making sure I did well in school, making sure I grew up to be the right person. Right by whose standards? By hers, of course, I shrugged. She knew what was best for me. Dr. Pierce looked at me carefully, and I realized that I'd repeated almost word for word what I'd said about how I felt about Wesley and Mirabel. I knew what was best for them. I wanted them to conform to my idea of the right life. Oh God, I whispered. I had turned into my mother. Many of us unconsciously repeat patterns of behavior we learned as children, Dr. Pierce said softly. Even the ones that hurt us, especially the ones that hurt us. That session was a turning point. I began to remember my childhood, not with nostalgia and idealization, but with honesty and a critical eye. I remembered how my mother controlled my every move, my every decision. How she disapproved of my choice to study math instead of literature, which she herself taught. How she criticized Horace. Too soft, too accommodating, not ambitious enough. How she interfered in our Wesley upbringing, insisting on her methods, her rules. I swore to myself that I would never be like her. I confessed in one of the sessions, and lo and behold, look what happened. I've gotten even worse. You're not worse, Bernice, Dr. Pierce countered. You're just a person who repeated a familiar pattern without realizing it. But now that you see it, you have a choice to continue or change. At my age, I grinned bitterly. Can an old dog be taught new tricks? The brain retains plasticity until death, she smiled. And it's not a matter of age, it's a matter of desire. Do you want to change, Bernice? Do you really want to change? I wondered. Did I want to? Part of me, that stubborn, controlling part that had been with me all my life, resisted. But another part, maybe that little girl who had once suffered from her mother's control, longed for freedom. Freedom from old resentments, from the fear of losing control, from the constant need to evaluate and correct everything and everyone. Yes, I said at last, I want to change. Not for Wesley or Roxy or even Mirabel. For me. I'm tired of being so unhappy. That was a hard confession to make. All my life I've thought of myself as a strong, independent, confident woman. It was painful to admit that underneath that mask was a deeply unhappy, insecure person. But it was the truth. And for the first time in many years, I allowed myself to see this truth without embellishments and self-deception. The therapy continued. Gradually, I began to understand the roots of my behavior: fear of being alone, fear of being unwanted, fear of losing control of the only thing that mattered to me, my family. I began to see how these fears were distorting my perceptions, causing me to act with the best of intentions, but in the worst of ways. I taught myself new reactions, new ways of thinking. It was hard. Sometimes I would snap, revert to old patterns, criticize myself for it as ruthlessly as I used to criticize others. But Dr. Pierce taught me to be patient with myself, reminding me that change doesn't happen overnight. You're taking small steps, Bernice, she said, but you're going in the right direction. I received only 2 messages from Wesley in those 3 months. Short, discreet, but not cold. He said he'd gotten my letter, that he respected my decision, that he and Roxy and Mirabel were fine. He didn't mention the possibility of a meeting, but he didn't say he didn't want to see me. He simply stated the facts, leaving me room to decide for myself. I didn't answer, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what to say. All words seemed empty. All promises seemed premature. I wasn't ready to come back into their lives. I wasn't sure I ever would be. But in the back of my mind, I cherished a faint hope that one day maybe we could build a new relationship. Not perfect, but honest and healthy. And so today, on this rainy day, I received a letter from Wesley. The envelope was on the table, and I stared at it, hesitant to open it. Whatever it was, news, rebukes, formal messages, it was a connection to my old life, to my family, to what I'd lost through my own stupidity and stubbornness. Finally, I gathered my courage and opened the envelope. Inside was a picture Mirabel on stage, in a fairy or elf costume, with glittering wings behind her back and a radiant smile on her face. A school concert by the looks of it. She had grown in those 3 months, a little taller, her facial features a little sharper, taking on a teenage shape. But her smile remained the same, open, sincere, full of life. The photograph was accompanied by a short note written in Wesley's neat handwriting. Mom, thought you might like to see this. Mirabel played the lead in the school play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Roxy made her costume. I helped make the wings. She asked about you. We said you were traveling but thinking about her. I hope you're doing well. Wesley. I ran my fingers over the photo as if trying to touch my granddaughter through the paper and distance. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a play about love, about magic, about transformation. Mirabel must have been playing Titania or one of the fairies. I imagined her spinning around the stage, her eyes shining, perhaps searching the audience for a glimpse of her grandmother's familiar face, and not finding it. It wasn't an invitation to come back. Wesley didn't ask me to come, didn't say they missed me or were waiting for me. But it was a gesture, a small, tentative step toward me, a sign that the door wasn't closed forever, that the connection wasn't permanently severed. I could have used it. I could have written back, asked for a meeting, started to slowly come back into their lives. But was I ready? Had I really changed enough to not hurt them again? I put the photo aside and walked over to the window. The rain had stopped and there were people in the park, a young mother with a stroller, an elderly couple holding hands, children running through the puddles. Ordinary life, ordinary people, each with their joys and sorrows, their mistakes and triumphs. I thought of Roxy, her patience, her wisdom, her ability to forgive, about how she protected her family without destroying the relationships that were important to her husband and daughter, about how she documented my manipulations not for revenge, but to preserve her own sanity in a situation that must have seemed absurd and painful to her. I thought of Wesley, my only son, the one son I loved more than life, but whom I had caused so much pain with my selfishness and control, of his ability to love no matter what, of his desire for harmony, of his willingness to give me a chance despite everything I'd done. And I thought of Mirabel, a pure, innocent, loving girl who didn't deserve to be a pawn in the games of adults, who deserved to grow up in an atmosphere of love and support, not intrigue and manipulation. I went back to the table and stared at the photograph for a long time. Then I took a blank piece of paper and began to write, "Dear Wesley, thank you for the picture. Mirabel looks happy and beautiful. I'm sure she was great as a fairy. I am doing well. Windhaven is a quiet, cozy town where it's easy to start a new life. I am continuing therapy, and it is helping me to understand a lot about myself and my relationship with you. I think of you often. You, Roxy, Mirabel. I hope you are happy and healthy. You deserve that. You deserve to live without the shadow of my toxic influence, without the fear that I will start my manipulations again. I'm not asking for a meeting. I'm not offering to come back into your life. Not because I don't want to, I do, more than anything, but because I'm not sure I've changed enough not to hurt you again. Because the best gift I can give you right now is to give you peace and space to be happy in your own way, not my way. Maybe one day I'll be ready. Maybe someday we can build a new relationship, not a perfect one, but an honest one. For now, I just want you to know that I love you and wish you all the happiness you've already found in each other. Love, your mother. Finishing the letter, I reread it, folded it, and put it away in my desk drawer. I wasn't sure I would send it, maybe later, when I was more sure of my words and feelings. The important thing now was that I could honestly say those words to myself, admit my guilt without self-justification, admit that the best thing I could do for my family right now was to leave them alone. I went to the window again. The sun peeked out from behind the clouds, and the puddles in the park glistened, reflecting the sky. The old oak tree, which had probably survived more than one generation of human drama and tragedy, rustled its leaves as if to say, "Everything passes, everything changes. Give yourself time." I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lonely. There was a long road ahead, a road to understanding myself, to accepting my mistakes, to possibly healing. I didn't know where it would lead me. I only knew that I had to walk it, step by step, day by day, choosing each time not between right and wrong, but between fear and love. And maybe that was the main lesson I had to learn in my 68 years of life.